Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the Endgame series with three of my favorite endgames played by Anatoly Karpov. Now, he is an incredible player, still is. He used to be extremely strong and he probably used to be the most precise player in the world, especially in strategic or positional middle games and in endgames, and especially in complex endgames. So this late middle game, early endgame stage of the game was, I think, what he was best at. So I'm going to try to show three of his games in which he just played perfectly. Now, the first game is Karpov Hort, played in '73, so just before he became the world champion. And then the last two games are just before he lost the world championship title in the first match against Kasparov. So this first match was never finished, and there's a lot of history on that. I actually have I don't know if you guys have this book in anywhere else. So there's this book, Garry Kasparov, The Star from Baku. It's obviously Zvezda is Baku. This is in Serbian or Croatian, written by Edward Gufeld and Dmitry Bielica. So these are good books just about the history of the match and Kasparov in general, but it's not the point. So the first game before he became the world champion, and the last two just before he lost the title. So these three questions you can see on the board. I actually got the exact phrasing of the questions from Jakub Agard's positional play, GM preparation positional play. He says in the introduction to the book that during his coaching career, he came up with a list of questions that used to be, I think he says 9 questions, and then he got it down to these 3. And whenever he is teaching his student or his student is trying to solve a tough position, he asks him to solve these 3 questions first, to ask himself these 3 questions. So whenever there's a complex position in front of you, you should answer these. Now, I think these are extremely applicable to endgames as well, as we are going to see. So just before you try to solve something I ask you to solve during the video, try to answer these 3 questions. They should help. By the way, I'm sorry if I sound strange. I had a cold, or I don't know, during the last week, so I'm sorry in advance. Okay, let's start. So Karpov has the white pieces here. This is an IQP position coming from the Tarrasch French. The second game is going to be an IQP position from the Tarrasch in the Queen's Gambit. But this should be about equal. If black plays perfectly, it's going to be tough for white to win. But if black plays imprecisely, slightly imprecisely, then white is going to have an easier game because the d5 pawn is a weakness and there's nothing black can do about that. Obviously, both sides have a light squared bishop, meaning that this pawn can be targeted by the bishop. These two are on light squares, meaning that the bishop has targets here as well. And most importantly, this knight does have some interesting outposts it could go to, for example, here, here, or here. The problem is white can drive it away from each of these squares, and this knight can never be driven away. Because the rook could never get to e4, white can simply play, or c4, white can simply play b3 or f3, and the knight will stay put. So let's begin. Karpov plays. This game is a perfect example of beautiful prophylaxis. Everything he did had to be done. Nothing was redundant. No move was spent in vain. Okay, so first he plays f3, preventing knight e4, knight g4. Great. Rook c8. Now he takes on c8, because if you move the rook, then black has the c file, and you concede the c file, and black would try rook e8 after that, trying to trade rooks again. So rook takes c8, bishop takes c8. Now king f2, getting the king closer. Perfect. Vlastimil Hort is not a beginner. His moves are great as well. He plays the best moves up to here. King e3, king e7. Now let's do something. So the king could advance to f4, but that doesn't really make much sense because it could be driven away with h6, g5, and the light squares are covered, so all black has to do is control these two squares. So what do? Pause the video and try to find the move for white. What would you do in this position? Okay, so if you tried answering the first question, well, for the moment, black has two weaknesses. It's d5 and a6, and this may be kind of subtle and hard, but when the weaknesses are on the board, you want to fix them. The weakness on d5 is fixed, the knight on d4 is controlling it, and the pawn is never moving. The pawn on a6 could move. If, for example, bishop d7, then a5, b4, and black gets rid of the weaknesses. So Karpov simply plays b4, and now these weaknesses are going to be here forever, or the weakness on a6. g6, good move by Hort, preventing knight f5. Now again, g4 prevents knight h5, and also prevents this knight from moving, because if the knight moves, well, firstly, if it goes to g8, then white probably wins because the knight is too bad. And if the knight goes to d7, then this move actually makes f4 possible, and then g5, doing the same thing on the king side that he did with pawn to b4, fixing weaknesses. So g4 is an excellent move, not a move many people would play. And also, as I said, prevents knight h5. So knight d7, Hort doesn't have a better option. He has to try infiltrating. But now f4, since the pawn on g4 is not attacked anymore. The knight goes to f8, and now g5. And this is just a picture of complete control in the endgame. The pawn on b4 is controlling two pawns. The pawn on g5 is controlling two pawns. The knight on d4 is controlling the entire board. And the bishop on b1 is, well, it's not the best bishop in the world. If you could get it, well, it is the best bishop in the world, actually, because it's going to be doing a lot of trouble. And there are targets for the bishop all over the board. Okay, king d6 played. What to suggest? I mean, it's a tough position. Okay, king f3. And in this position, well, Hort goes badly wrong. However, if you... Well, let's try to find the move. Well, in this position he traded knights. Why is that bad? Well, trading knights is a dreadful idea because the white bishop has three targets and the black bishop has no targets, so you want to keep the knights on the board, otherwise you lose. But if you, for example, play knight d7 and try to decline the knight trade, firstly, this knight doesn't have a single square to go to. It could try to get into c4 or a4, but it's not doing anything there. Also, white could just take it. And if you play knight d7, then white simply plays g4 and whatever. Let's say you play your knight b6 idea, I just continue and break open the position and create a passed pawn. Obviously, king here would not be a good move because I have a check and I could repeat, or I could, well, maybe not f5 straight away, but eventually I'm going to play g4, f5. Maybe I can wait after knight b6. Okay, so knight e6 played by Hort, not knight d7, offering a trade. And now, obviously, white is happy to trade off the knights. Bishop takes e6 and king e3. It's very important to prevent d4. This was the key move. Bishop g4, bishop to d3, stopping this bishop from activating. Bishop e6 and king d4. And now this is easy to win because there are three things you want to do. There are four things you want to do. If you do one of these four things, you will win. Well, I'll ask you to pause the video and make a list of four things which, if you achieve one of these, you win. Okay, so the first thing is win the a6 pawn. The second thing is win the h7 pawn. The third thing is win the d5 pawn. The fourth thing is get in on one of these two squares with your king. If any of these four things happen, white simply wins. So what can we do? We can target the d5 pawn twice. We can try to get into the position with our bishop. So g4 is the only square we could get to. And if we get to c8, we are targeting a6. It's much harder to try and get to e6 and then to g8. Okay, now, one thing we have to worry about is if we get our bishop to c8 and we take the pawn on a6, Now let's just imagine the bishop is on a6. The black king could then be on c6 and the bishop on d7. In that case, our bishop cannot escape. So that's something we have to take care of. Obviously, we could then break with a4 and try to, well, force a capture ba4, but then too many pawns would be traded off. So another thing we have to be careful about is we don't want to trade pawns, we want to win pawns, because if we trade pawns, it's going to be a draw. Okay, now let's see what Karpov does. Bishop g4, bishop c2, the plan is bishop b3 and win the pawn. Bishop e6 back. Hort has no way to make progress. Bishop b3 anyway. Now this bishop is forced to stay on this diagonal, and this king is forced to stay on d6. So if the king moves, then the white king enters and white wins. If the bishop moves away from this diagonal, then bishop takes and white wins. If this pawn moves, white wins. If this pawn moves, white wins. So logically, black is in Tungsram except for two moves, bishop f7 and bishop g8. So bishop f7, bishop d1, Karpov now reroutes, bishop e6. And it was important for the bishop to get back to e6 because bishop g4 was a threat. Bishop f3, again, putting black in Tungsram. So you have to choose. If you play bishop d7, for example, staying on this diagonal to prevent bishop g4, then I take on d5. If you play bishop f7, as was played in the game, then I get to play bishop g4 and I enter. And in this position, actually, Vlastimil Hort resigned. Let me show you why. So let's go back to this position. Bishop f7, bishop d1, bishop e6, had to prevent bishop g4, and after bishop f3, it's Tungsram. It's just all over. You cannot stay on both diagonals at the same time, and you cannot move your king. Let's see why. If after bishop g4, for example, you wait again with bishop g8. Now, in this position, after bishop c8, king c6, of course you don't take the pawn. This is what I was talking about, because now just bishop e6, and your bishop is not getting out. The king and bishop are controlling it. You have to play a4 and break. However, after king c6, you have a very simple way to win. You can just continue g3, just waiting to see what he does. Let's say king b6. And now bishop g4. And what you are preparing to do is eventually enter the position or win this pawn, where black will basically be powerless. And if he doesn't move the king, if he leaves the bishop here, then you simply create a passed pawn and you have too many threats. Or after bishop g4, if bishop e8 is played, for example, then again bishop to c8, and in this position, if king c6, then bishop e6 can be played and you win this pawn. And if bishop to f7, preventing that, then you actually can take on a6 because the king is not on c6 yet. And if king c6, you can just go back and you have time. So I think this was just a perfect game. I remember looking at this game for the first time about 2 years ago. I was fascinated with how he just won without doing anything. Okay, now, Karpov-Kasparov. This is game 9 of the championship. As you know, this World Championship match was stopped after 6 months of play. And Kasparov had won the last few games before the match was stopped. And Campomanes, the FIDE president at the time, after a lot of controversy, decided to continue the match in September, or to hold a new match in September of 85. And as you know, Kasparov had won the second match. Okay, so we start in this very complex early endgame where both sides have two rooks, bishop, knight. The material is equal. And, well, what does white do? Well, firstly, Karpov starts with king to g2. That's a good move. And Kasparov plays rook to c5. And now basically, because he has the isolated queen's pawn, because he has no attack, because his bishop on e6 is guarding d5, Kasparov has nothing better but to play for a draw. And in this position, after rook c5, Karpov decides to exchange rooks and to simplify the position, to highlight the target on d5. So he takes on c4. And in this position, well, this is an interesting decision. So if you are black, what do you recapture with? Have a look at this position. And again, ask yourself the three questions from black's perspective. Okay, so there are two options. You can take with the rook or with the pawn. Obviously, taking with the rook loses a pawn if white wishes to take it. And taking with the pawn allows an infiltration, which is going to be tough to defend against. So let me show you what happens if dc4. If dc4, you have a 3-2 pawn majority. That looks very nice. But after rook d6 and a5 and rook b6, it's not easy to hold these pawns, and whatever you do, you basically lose material. You can try knight d7, for example, but after rook takes b5, rook takes b5, knight takes b5, and something like knight c5, white should simply be better, and maybe black holds, but white should be much better. In the game, Kasparov saw that, of course, and he played rook takes c4. Now, I'll ask you another question. Pause the video. Would you take the pawn with white? Okay, so taking the pawn leads to an immediate draw. Let me show you how. So knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop d5 check, rook d5 and rook c2, and draw agreed. Of course, after b4 and rook c3, for example, and a4, ba4, rook a5, for example, and a3, rook a6, white is a pawn up, but that's after rook b3, it's just going to be a draw, and these pawns will be traded off, and then it's 4-3 on the same side of the board, draw. So Karpov, of course, does not do that. He does not win the pawn. He plays an excellent move. He plays rook d4, and of course, if this is taken, then that means that, again, same as in the Hort game, Karpov has a target, Kasparov doesn't. So if the pawn is stuck on d5, there's a target. Also, again, Karpov will move the bishop, play f3, stop knight e4, knight g4, and win. King f8 played by Kasparov, bishop e2, and rook takes d4 in this position. The rook, basically, if the rook moves away, then white is controlling the fourth rank, and white has managed to make some progress. Rook takes d4, e takes d4, king e7, knight a2, and this knight is now rerouting to b4, either provoking a5 or getting into the position, targeting these two squares. Bishop c8 played, defending the pawn in anticipation of knight b4, king d6, f3. We know the pattern already. Knight g8, the knight reroutes to h6. h4, good, locking down the king side. We know this pattern as well. Knight h6, king f2, the king improves, and now knight to f5. Now, I'll ask you a question here. Pause the video. Which side wants to trade knights? Okay. Of course, white would like to trade knights, not black. Why? Because this is a target and this is not a target if the knight is not on the board. So obviously the knight on f5 is targeting d4. If we trade the knights off, the knight is not targeting d4. And d4 is on a dark square, d5 is on a light square. So this bishop will have a target, this bishop will not have a target. Knight c2 first of all. Excuse me, I got disconnected from the internet. Give me 1 minute, I have to connect to my mobile network. Excuse me. Yeah, my internet will sometimes do that. Okay, I tried to play knight c2. So knight c2 simply defends the pawn. Come on. Okay, I don't seem to be able to connect to the internet. It will be okay. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So, Kasparov does not want to trade knights, but it's going to be hard declining this trade. Okay, let's see if we are back. Okay, knight f2, knight c2. Okay, great. Okay, so the idea behind knight c2 is to simply defend the pawn and prepare bishop to d3 and trade this knight off or force it to go back, which means that this knight will be able to get back into the position. f6 played and bishop to d3. And now Well, again, another question. Now you know that black doesn't want to trade knights, but can you decline the trade? Do you have time to decline the trade of knights? I'll ask you to analyze two moves. Look, you can analyze g5, which was played in the game, seeking counterplay, or you can analyze knight e7, trying to prevent the knight trade. So analyze both moves and decide which is better. Okay, g5 was played in the game, we'll get to that. Knight e7 is not a bad move, but it's quite easy for white to make progress. For example, after knight e3, what do you do? Let's say king to e6. I don't know what to suggest. Well, white can simply go for g4. Even if you don't block the bishop, white can go for g4. And then eventually try to create a passed pawn here, where these two pawns, if nothing is traded, are controlling the black king. And if the trade happens, well then, I'm making progress and you're not. So declining the trade is not good. But it's better than what happened in the game, I think. Because after g5, and bishop takes f5, and bishop takes f5, and knight e3, this is strategically just busted. And this knight is so much better than the bishop, and it has a target as opposed to the bishop, that white is risking nothing and can only play for a win. Now let's see what happens. In two moves, you're going to see my favorite move of the game, and probably one of my favorite Karpov moves ever. Okay, bishop b1 by Kasparov. b4, we know why he does this. He played it in the last game too. So one pawn is controlling two pawns. gh4. Now, I'm not going to ask you to pause the video, because then you'll know that he didn't play gh4. This is my favorite move, by the way. So he didn't play gh4. But this next move is just beautiful. Okay, so Kasparov just took a pawn. You can take back, or do something else which allows Kasparov to take another pawn with check. So, firstly, let's see why he didn't take. Well, if g takes h4, then, for example, bishop d3 and knight g2, and obviously want to get in here. But after bishop g6, knight f4, bishop e8, you're not making any progress. Why are you not making any progress? Your king is not getting into the position. The bishop can always try and control this square, or the king, and it's not going to be easy to win. This is basically a fortress. Or maybe a supercomputer wins, but for a human it will be tough. Instead, he just allowed his king into the position and traded this one for this one a few moves later. He plays knight g2. And now you're getting in knight f4 with tempo. Obviously, Kasparov now has to take. If he doesn't, then knight takes. So hg3, king g3. Now the king is getting in. If you try bishop g6 now, then knight f4, and your king is never getting into the position. And after, for example, bishop f7 or bishop e8, then king h4, and this pawn is dropping, and then this pawn is dropping, and then this is weak. So after king takes g3, Kasparov rushes to play king e6 to make sure his king is not cut off, but knight f4 check, king f5, and knight takes h5. And now you can see that there are 3 targets in the black position, there are 0 targets in the white position, or no targets that he could get to. Now, in this position, king e6 was played. Well, if you don't play king e6, then this bishop is stuck out of the game. Also, if you don't play king e6, I'm going to play knight f4, and you're not going to be able to defend this pawn. So king e6, but now knight f4 anyway. King d6, the only move, and now king g4. And basically, he's going to do either this or this, and round up this pawn. And what do you do about that? Bishop c2, he just waits. King h5 played. Bishop d1 targeting f3, and now king g6 just trading weaknesses. King e7 defending this one, and now you can either play knight h5 or you can play knight takes d5. Knight takes d5 was played in the game. This is just busted. Takes, king e6, knight c7, king d7, knight a6, and everything is just falling apart. And well, this is now game over. Obviously, if the pawns are traded off, it's going to be a draw. The problem is that the black king can never take the a3 pawn because this pawn is queening. So here is one key position. Okay, after knight g6, Kasparov played king back to c4. If he plays king b3, then simply knight f4, and this pawn is going to queen. For example, bishop b7 and d5, king c4 and king e4, and this pawn is queening. So king c4 played, but now knight e7, king b7, knight f5, and in this position he had one last hope. He could have played king d5, trying to hold on. White gets the opposition and eventually breaks with a4. That's now the winning plan when the king is blockading. So for example, king e6, and eventually white gets the king to b3 and plays a4 and wins. However, Kasparov played bishop g2, and now this just allows knight d6 check, winning another pawn. So king b3 and knight takes b5, and after king a4, knight d6, Kasparov resigned. If you take the pawn, then again this pawn is queening. So I thought this was just an extraordinary game, and this was the key moment, the most beautiful move of the game. I think that, well, finding this move requires extreme concentration, extreme knowledge, and also great endgame instincts. This is just a brilliant move. Okay, now let's get over to the last game. Okay, so bishop e2 played by Karpov. Kasparov has black. This was also a queen's gambit, and if we put the white pawn on h3, then the pawn structure is completely symmetrical. Now, before we move on, pause the video and ask yourself the 3 questions you can see on the board from white's perspective. Pause the video and try to get into this position. It's not going to be easy. Okay, this is in fact a very rich position. Even though it seems boring, it's extremely rich. Why? Well, white has one huge advantage over black. Well, you could argue that this knight is worse than the knight on f3, but that's not as important. The most important thing is that this bishop on c8 is incredibly weak, and if it doesn't improve, then black is going to be playing 2 pieces down, basically, so the bishop has to improve. So what can you do to improve it? Well, you can try to play a5 and bishop a6, but for that the knight would have to move, and that takes too much time. You can play bishop b7, for example, but if you play bishop to b7, you are still going to have to liberate the bishop with c5, so you can play c5 and bishop b7. If you play bishop to d7, then the bishop doesn't really have a future, and after c4, c5, you're running the risk of, well, losing the bishop. And white has a positional threat of playing c4, c5, where if I, for example, let's just play a few stupid moves. Rook d8 here, and let's play rook b8 and c5. In this position, it's really tough to develop this bishop. Okay, now the rook is hanging. It's just, if c5 is played, then positionally this bishop has no squares. So Kasparov has a choice to make. What do you do with the c8 bishop? If you turn on the engine in this position, it says it's equal. It's just all zeros. Maybe it's 0.1 for white, but not a real advantage at all. Because the engine can solve this issue. However, a human cannot solve this issue. c5 played by Kasparov, which is the best move. You have to play c5, bishop b7. But here's the issue. If you've asked yourself the 3 questions before we started, then you would have known that this is the worst piece. And to liberate it, to play c5 creates the biggest weakness in the position. And now, what Karpov did to this pawn seems extremely simple, but it shows great understanding of the position. Okay, firstly, rook f to c1. This is a good move, and defends the pawn and prepares to liberate his other pieces. Bishop to b7 played, now king f1, obviously also making room for the king by moving the rook. Bishop to d5, bishop to d5 played, improving the bishop slightly, and also making room for rook c8 and rook b8 and activating his pieces, also targeting the a2 pawn. Now, rook b5 played, and taking this pawn or trading this one off for this one would justify the move rook c1, and basically, yeah, this wouldn't be good. So knight d7 defending the pawn first, and now rook to a5. Instead of knight d7, which is the losing move according to the engine, but I find it very understandable, the engine plays rook a to c8, and here is why. It prepares to create a fortress with knight d7 and rook c7 and bishop c8, and that way a7 and d5 are defended. First, let's have a look at what happened after knight d7. After knight d7, rook a5 targets two weaknesses, and what's going to happen is whatever black does, black played rook fb8, white played c4, and after the bishop moved, all white has to do is either play knight d2, knight b3, or knight d2, knight e4, or he has to play knight e1, knight d3 to target this pawn, target it twice, and obviously the rook cannot defend, the bishop is on a light square, and the pawn drops. What the engine does is rook a c8, and after rook a5, let's just do the same things, then rook c7 defends, and after c4, you drop the bishop back to a8, so it's not in the way of anything. And after knight d2 or knight e1, doesn't really matter, you can play rook d8, and if knight b3, for example, targeting the pawn, then knight d7. And this is a fortress which the engine holds. It's not easy to break through. This bishop is a good piece, and the knight is in the way of the rook, but it's holdable. Okay, so that's what the engine does, but that's very hard to find. Okay, knight d7 by Kasparov, rook a5, rook fb8, c4, bishop c6, knight e1, and now it's very simple. Rook b4 played by Kasparov, bishop d1, just improving the bishop, and this was an important move. After rook b7, bishop d1 is important because you want to play bishop b3, firstly defending these two, and secondly stopping any infiltration. Okay, he could have played king f8, I think, instead of moving the rook was not attacked, so he could have done that, but after knight d3, the rook has to move anyway and the pawn drops. Okay, so rook b7, f3, preventing any counterplay before going for the pawn. Obviously, he would have played knight d3 and won the pawn already, but f3 is more precise, because then the king can move and nothing is hanging. Rook d8. Knight d3, g5, before taking the pawn, firstly bishop b3, preventing rook to b2. Of course, if you take, then rook b2 is a threat. King f8, and now knight takes c5, and after knight c5, rook c5, it's simply a pawn up. And this is a very famous endgame, so I'm going to show it to you until the end, because Karpov's play was perfect. But basically, he won the game already, and this is indefensible for black if white plays precisely. Rook d6, defending the bishop, king e2, king e7, rook d1, improving all of his pieces. Of course, Karpov doesn't mind the rook trade. Also, if the bishops are traded off, it's probably still winning for white because of the passed pawn on c4, but black would have excellent drawing chances, so Karpov does not want to trade off the bishops. Trading off rooks, I think, is winning for white, but much harder than with the rooks on the board. King d6, rook a5, f5, king e2, h5. And what Kasparov is trying to do, he's trying to trade off pawns. If, for example, if you trade off all of these, it's an easy draw, because bishop and rook versus rook is a draw, so this bishop could just give itself up for the last pawn, and it's going to be easy. e4, f takes e4, f takes e4, bishop takes e4. Now, this was a pawn trade, obviously, and let's go back to this position. So, sorry for not highlighting this before. If you ask yourself the three questions now, what's the worst placed piece? Well, it's this bishop probably. What are the weaknesses? There are basically no weaknesses in the black position now, except for the a7 pawn, but that's sufficiently defended. So with e4, Karpov creates a huge weakness. Obviously, if you drop the bishop back, then white has gained something and could even advance with pawn to e5, for example, gaining more space with the king. This would be huge for white, because this is now a target and the king was forced back. So after e4 you have to take, but it's a favorable pawn trade for white. After fe4, fe4, bishop e4, rook takes g5. And now obviously this is a target, this is a target, and this is a target. So from one weakness he got to have 3 weaknesses to target. Bishop f5, king e3, h4, king d4, e5 check, okay, a bit of space, bishop b1, a3, getting the pawn of a light square finally, rook e7, preparing to push the pawn, rook g4, targeting h4, h3. Now, well, I'm just going to say both moves win. You can play g3 or gh3. Karpov played g3. I'd like to invite you to calculate both. And the engine plays gh3, but the engine is cold-blooded and sees everything. It's much easier to play g3. If you take the pawn, then bishop f5 chases the rook away, and after rook h4 you play e4. And basically you now have to block this pawn. And if the pawn advances, then it's going to be complicated. Also, these pawns are double. The bishop and the rook control the h7 square, and it's winning, but it's going to be risky. You cannot make mistakes. After g3, the only problem you have is this rook coming in and winning the h2 pawn. So what you basically have to make sure is that your bishop is on this diagonal, so that whenever the h3 pawn starts marching forward, you can take it. And Karpov did that. Okay, so e4 was one of the best moves in this game. I'm sorry again for ruining it. Okay, rook e8, rook g7, rook f8. Karpov obviously doesn't care about h2 if he can win the a7 pawn, because he's going to get the bishop on the diagonal. And Kasparov thinks, well, I don't care about a7 because I'll take on h2. So rook a7, rook f2, king b4, rook h2, c5 check, the key move, king c6. And now all we have to do is get the bishop here. So bishop a4 check, king d5, rook d7 check, king e4, c6, he has time. Rook b2 check, not bishop c3. That would be a huge blunder. King a5, rook b8, c7, rook c8, and now king b6. And after king e3, bishop c6, it's over. We are controlling the diagonal. The king, well, cannot really approach. h2, g4 saves the pawn. Rook h8, preparing to queen, but not really preparing to queen, because I'll give up my bishop and then queen myself. Rook d1, great move. Just preventing all counterplay and targeting the bishop. Also, maybe rook e1, rook e1, king f4, rook e4 check. Just defending the pawn. Doesn't allow any counterplay. Rook e5, king g4, and rook e2 played. And this is the final move of the game. Here Kasparov resigned. If you queen again, I queen, and after that I'm just a piece up. So yeah, Karpov's endgame play was, I think, well, his endgames are one of the best in the history of chess. It's just very instructive. His play was very instructive. It still is, but he's not as strong anymore. Okay, I hope you got something from the video. Let me know what you think about it. And yeah, sorry about the break. As I said, I had some issues. Hopefully I'll get back to recording every day now. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.